And I would like to introduce the CEO of TSNE Mission Works, Elaine.
Thank you, Elliot. Please have a seat. Hi, everyone. Oh, is this good? Okay. Welcome, everyone. It's so great to see so many people here. Thank you for stepping out to this panel in the City Awake Festival. TSNE Mission Works is honored to host this event for the first urgency of now. And before we begin, I just want to give a quick shout out to the staff of City Awake. Can you all raise your hand or stand up? Whoa, thank you. Thank you for doing all of this organizing. And also, Sheena's not here, but Sheena Collier is the amazing community person at the Chamber. So we should just all give her a shout out because it's through her work that we've organized all of this. And then to the panel and our moderator, thank you. And to the great staff at TSNE Mission Works who worked behind the scenes to make today happen. Thank you all. So I'm especially excited to be here because TSNE has been part of a long-time effort in the nonprofit sector for the last decade that has been working on the need to transition leadership to the next generation. It's been going on, I think, for 20 years. And as multiple reports and studies have pointed out, baby boomers are now retiring in unprecedented numbers. And we've known about this for a long time, but now it's actually happening. So the need to transition leadership to the next generation of young people and of young leaders is no longer just a luxury, but is an urgent necessity. And as the Building Movement Project's Race to Lead report, are folks familiar with that? That report has pointed out in very stark language and data that it's not for lack of leadership that we haven't transitioned to the next generation. It's not for lack of academic or experiential leadership. It's because there's an opportunities, and it's especially true for young people of color, young leaders of color. So, the structural, institutional, and societal racism and challenges that are in place are a lot of the things that are preventing young people, young leaders, millennials from moving into leadership positions. So I'm not a millennial, unfortunately, but I am a woman of color and I am in leadership in the nonprofit sector. And I'm inspired by the fierce voice and the urgency that young people, young leaders have taught me, because you are leading the work for us now. And leaving my generation in the dust. But you are really leading this work and changing the paradigm of what leadership looks like. And sheer numbers, the leaders, young leaders of color, by sheer numbers, are an unprecedented amount in our society and in our sector. So it's inspiring to see that folks are advocating and taking leadership to change our institutional challenges and our institutional racist structures. And as TSNE Mission Works Wage Equity Matters report points out, there's sheets of data around the room, and I know the panel will address some of this later. But as this report points out, there's significant gaps that still exist and persist in wage equity that's based on gender and race and age. And I firmly believe that it's going to be your generation, the millennials of color especially, who will be the driving force in eliminating these gaps as you take on leadership in our society and in our sector. And now I'm going to turn this over to the panel, who are doing a lot of the work that I just talked about. And before that, I want to introduce you to our moderator for this evening. It's Miriam Ortiz. Miriam Ortiz is an accomplished leader in her own right. She has, since 2000, been highly and deeply involved in community organizing, youth development, and advocacy work. She's held multiple leadership positions at the Italian Home for Children and at Central Latino, and is also the founder and the board chair of the Student Immigrant Movement, which really focuses on providing young people who are undocumented with the experience, the support, and the strength to advocate and organize themselves against injustice. So welcome, Miriam, and Miriam will introduce you to the rest of the panel.
All right. Thank you so much, Elaine. Thanks, everybody, for being here. I want to remind folks that this is being live streamed and that we have a hashtag #FunInBoss, #WageEquity. So since this is an event for millennials, I'm going to do the obligatory thing and ask you to take a selfie. I'm going to do that right now, so please take your phone. And I'm going to give you 10, 15 seconds, and I'm going to do that with the panelists. Ready? Oh, yeah. I don't see people doing it. I want to make sure that this night is being captured.
Wait, I wasn't ready. Oh.
All right.
Okay, wait, my turn.
Oh, nuts, okay.
Wait, is this gonna work?
Yes. Awesome. So again, the hashtag to share that on social media is #FunInBoss, #WageEquityMatters. How we doing there? #WageEquityMatters. So while you're doing that, I want to take a moment before we start our program to recognize that today is the 1-year anniversary of Maria, where our brothers and sisters from Puerto Rico experienced incredible devastation in the island. And as we take the time to reflect and look back, I want to make sure that we're holding this space to recognize that there are actions happening in the city that want to remind us about this commitment to, as Americans, make sure that we deliver on the promise of recovery for our brothers and sisters over there. The U.S. Virgin Islands, correct. So all of those communities of Americans that have been affected by it. So just wanted to give a shout out to some of the organizations that are doing the work in reminding ourselves of that commitment. Agitarte, Raíces Boricuen, Seas of Our Ancestors, and the event that's happening today is Después de María, Marching and Healing a year after. So we can give a round of applause, send that energy to our brothers and sisters who are doing that work. So next I want to introduce you to our lovely panelists. We'll have a chance to get to know a little bit more about them as we get started with the question. But here we have Lawrence Bariner II, who is an independent consultant. Please help me in welcoming him. We have Manisha Butra, who is an alderman at large for the city of Melrose and a senior program manager at the Mass Housing Partnership. Thank you. Right here in the center, we have Jeanette Andre, who's a deputy director for the Lenny Sagan Fund. And last but not least, Cristina Haynes, who's the volunteer manager for Silver Lining Mentoring here in Boston. So to get this conversation started, I know that many of you came in early, had an opportunity to chat with folks you hadn't seen in a while, but you see these posters going around. Who had an opportunity to stop by and read some of the statistics? If you can raise your hand. Yeah, this is the report that Elaine was referencing earlier from TS&E Mission Works, the compensation report they come up with last year. So for those of you who have your hand up, yeah, we had an opportunity to see that. Who was depressed by those statistics? Yes? You're not depressed by them? Depressed. All right. Depressed. Because the picture is really dire and the data is telling us what is happening. There was one in particular that was very striking to me, which is that a one-bedroom apartment in the city of Boston with utilities is $19,032. And yet, now, as we're thinking about this sector, 44% of the nonprofit workers in this city are making less than $31,000. So just think about that for a second, right? We are a sector who is in charge of moving all of our causes forward, but at the same time, we're not taking a moment to reflect on some of our practices and what are we doing to perpetuate those injustices. So that was depressing. Now, in regards to leadership, right, there is this picture that we know very well that representation in high leadership positions in all of our organizations is not reflective of the populations that we're serving, as well as the employees that are there in terms of Blacks and Hispanics, right? We are 4% and 2% relatively of CEOs. So with this in mind, the conversation that we want to have today is what can we do to retain and continue to grow this leadership of millennials of colors in the sector, right? If we're talking about $31,000, some of those entry-level positions, people sometimes qualify for public benefits. And so what are the things that organizations can do besides compensation? This is about having a holistic approach and view about how do we move leadership of millennials of color forward. So with that in mind, I hope that tonight we have an opportunity to learn more about what that looks like on the ground from our wonderful panelists. So I'm going to get started with the first question. So can you tell us a bit about who you are and how you ended up in the position that you're at?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me on this panel. I'm really happy to be here. My name is Cristina Haynes, and I'm originally from Taunton, which is south of Boston, but then I spent 10 years after college living in Boston, Cambridge, and now I live north of Boston. And I'm the volunteer manager for Silver Lining Mentoring, which is an organization that exclusively serves youth in foster care with mentoring and life skills development. And I was drawn to this position in a very personal way. As a volunteer with the organization for over 2 years to a young person, and also as a future adoptive parent. And I had done quite a bit of equity work throughout my career. The first 10 years of my career, I worked at Harvard University, firstly in intercultural relations, and then at the Global Health Institute, working on issues of health equity and social determinants of health. And it was through this personal connection of my volunteer work and the transition in my personal life to growing my family through adoption from foster care that I began to take a more critical look at the system and was just floored by the disparities in life outcomes that youth in care were facing, and furthermore, the overrepresentation of youth of color in foster care, period. And I decided that Silver Lining Mentoring was the way that I wanted to make an impact on that issue of vulnerable families, vulnerable youth, because they were addressing what I felt no other organization was in the same way, which is providing voluntary relationships, connection that wasn't through a paid provider or a service provider, but was really about establishing those organic connections for young people. And also doing so with Silver Lining's values of cultural responsiveness, being strengths-based, being youth-focused. So it was the values of the organization and what Silver Lining provides that really I felt was the best way for me to make an impact in my career, and was so appreciative that it connected so well with my personal values and the issues of equity that I was most concerned with. There were a few touch points in my career that I want to mention here and happy to talk about as we move through the discussion that I feel were intentional programs and opportunities in place that allowed me to have an equitable path to what I was able to achieve in my career and how I was able to progress to what I feel were positions that were of leadership positions in the organizations I've been in. One of those was a tuition assistance program that allowed me to obtain a master's degree for a total cost of about $500, a master's degree from Harvard. And a fellowship program specifically for leaders of color that I participated in that gave me exceptional connections that I still draw upon, as well as having 4 supervisors or leaderships of the organization, 4 supervisors of color, and my relationships with them and the mentorship they provided.
Hello, my name is Jeanette Andre, and I'm the Deputy Director at the Lenny Zakim Fund. At the fund, we support social justice grassroots nonprofits by providing grants, technical assistance, and professional development training, networking, and resource connecting. And you know, when you put this question on paper, I had a really hard time with figuring out like how I got to the place that I got, because I feel like it was all just a happy accident how I ended up in the jobs that I served in, and the roles that I served in. So I started as an internship in Washington, D.C. in a philanthropic membership organization, and I thought, like, what the heck is philanthropy? As a young Filipina woman growing up in a relatively rural area of Florida, I knew that I was recipient of programs and services that relied on philanthropy, but never thought about that part of the sector as a career. And so I got into this and had an internship, and then if you want to talk about wage equity, I was in AmeriCorps Vista at Social Venture Partners out in Seattle. In a lot of these spaces, I was one of the only, if not the only person of color in the room. And to be very transparent, I'm also half white, and so I want to recognize the privileges and advantages that I got from growing up with a white father. And so I don't really know how I got here, but I'm really glad that I'm here at this point, because I think my role at the Lenny Zakim Fund and philanthropy in general is to drive the conversation forward around race, around equity, around how we use our power to start conversations and support community leaders who are the experts, who are making real change on the ground. And I think that that's something that's starting to flip within philanthropy, right? Is seeing people who are doing the work as experts and not philanthropy telling people what to do, but it's a constant struggle. And I think, like all those like old congressmen who want to like stay in power, you have to continue to push back, and every step, 2 steps forward, you still take 1 step back. And so my role at the Lenny Zakim Fund specifically is to provide professional development training with grassroots leaders to make sure that not only are they equipped with the opportunities that they need and the connections that they need, but they have the skills development and internal networking with each other in order to support their ability to do their work. So I'm really excited about that. And the way that we define social justice at the Lenny Zakim Fund are leaders and organizations who are reflective of and have started within the community. So we're not looking for organizations from the outside to parachute in and create change. We're really trying to find people with personal connections in those communities and uplift their work and help them and partner with them. I don't want to say help because I think that is patriarchal, but to partner with them and have them leverage our resources and our networks to be able to effectively make social justice and social change happen.
Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I have like one of the wireless
Funny
mics, so it's totally on. My name is Manisha Butra. I want to thank TS&E for putting this together. As I've been telling the folks who put it together, I think they put so much work into this panel and bringing everyone in this room together. I'm very excited to be here. Thank you all for taking time out of your day to hear us and hopefully hear from each other. I'm a senior program manager at the Massachusetts Housing Partnership, where I work with cities and towns across the state on developing more affordable housing. My background is in city planning. I have a master's degree in city planning, and I've worked for over a decade, more than that now. I'm an old millennial, so I was excited to be qualified. I was born in 1980, so if you take the first 2 years of my totally cusp, the year it's in and the last 2, so 20 plus 18, sorry, that was a really bad description. 20 plus 18, you get my age, which is approaching 40, but not 40 yet. So my career is in city planning, but I also am a newly elected official in the city of Melrose, where I served as an alderman at large, which is essentially city council the first person of color ever to be elected, which has been an interesting journey. Thank you. And I think as we all do, I carry with me many identities. I'm an Indian American woman, heterosexual, cisgender. I'm married to an awesome husband, have a 6-year-old kid. I'm the daughter of immigrants. My extended family is all over North America and all over the world, including in India. I'm physically and economically mobile, and I try to think about all of those things and sort of my identity, both in terms of where I feel like a minority, but also where I feel like I have privilege, and how can I be constantly reflective in those things in my work as a planner and as an elected. So I commute on the bus and the Orange Line from Melrose, but I also have the means to take a Lyft or a taxi or the commuter rail when I want to. So again, I love taking the bus, which is how we know a mutual friend, is like through my bus. In terms of how I got to where I am, you know, it's a combination of kind of constant reflection on personal mission and like thinking about what really drives me and trying to seek the work that best aligns with that. I would like to say fulfills that, but it's sort of like fulfillment is this ongoing thing. So I guess best aligns with it. And in the last couple of years, I think I've done a lot of reflecting on realizing that equity and social justice were really central to what I wanted to do. But that I've also always seen myself as somebody who likes working within the system, but likes working within the system to change it. So that's sort of one piece in terms of like thinking about how I got to where I am now and where I want to go. The other thing is learning like how to network, and how much networking is both a way that people who have had a seat at the table have sort of had access to networks, but also how I have been able to use my networks or build networks and build relationships to get a seat at the table. So that's a little bit about who I am.
Thank you.
I don't have a mic.
Here you go.
Can we share?
Yeah.
So my name is Lawrence. I'm going to use a timer. I tend to be long-winded, and as a man, I want to be really conscious of not taking up more space than I'm allotted. So who I am, I think about myself in terms of identities similarly. So I identify as Black, identify as queer. I'm about to turn 30, which feels bizarre. I am a Floridian. I grew up in Tallahassee. I consider myself a Southerner, but I've been in Boston for 10 years. And I think I was saying to Tiffany earlier, who I met, I was like born into this sector. My dad's a pastor, my mom is a teacher, and I just have been in nonprofits for as long as I can remember. So I think that's really how I got here. But in terms of like my arc from birth, born in Atlanta, grew up in Tallahassee, Florida, came to Boston for undergrad, and then took some time off from undergrad to do some like soul searching, personal, spiritual exploration. And while doing some of that, found a lot of things, but one of them was that the people who I felt the most aligned with tended to work in the nonprofit sector. And so that's how I got back into the sector from my birth pathway. And now I consider myself similarly someone who is actually, like, I often am in the system working to shift the system, but right now I am an independent consultant, so I also believe in like multi-pronged strategies for social change. So I'm currently outside, but I like hop back and forth from inside to outside.
Thank you so much. Oh yes, we have another mic. So the next question is, you know, we have heard some of the similar themes about representation and what it means to be the only person of color in an organization, what it means to work from within or outside a system. So I'm wondering, what are you working on specifically that impacts equity matters for millennials of color? And you can interpret that as you see fit. That's all right. Anybody will want to take this one?
I'm happy to start on some of this. So, what I'm working on at Silver Lining Mentoring is to impact the child welfare system, but also to infuse everything we do at Silver Lining Mentoring with a discussion about racial equity. And as I mentioned, how that affects how youth enter the child welfare system. African American youth are twice as likely to enter the system as their white counterparts, and more likely to stay in the system longer and to age out, which is a large portion of the youth that we work with. And we want to make sure that, and 75% of the young people in our programs are youth of color. We want to make sure that our mentors reflect that diversity so that young people, as they are simultaneously being pulled away from communities and caregivers that may share their racial identity, are able to be connected back in to that community through voluntary mentors. And so it's an important part of my role in my approach to the work to figure out how to make those connections and to facilitate those types of conversations in our community. And I see mentoring relationships as helping build those bridges. We know that Boston is incredibly segregated on so many levels, and often these intangible levels of just connection and relationships. And it's so inspiring in the work that we do to be able to see those connections bridge neighborhoods, communities, generations, and the many aspects of identity and intersectionality. And so I'm new in this role at Silver Lining Mentoring, 3 months into this position, but as I said, many years connected to the organization, and really am looking to help grow that conversation and be part of the conversation around racial equity, both within the work that we do, working with youth, but also as part of what our city is undertaking.
I wonder if others are seeing this similar dynamic of wanting to be representative of the populations that you're serving, and what are your organizations are doing in order to fulfill that promise, or how does it manifest in your work? That's okay. So the question that we're discussing is how the work that the panelists have been involved in impact equity matters for millennials. And so right now we're having this discussion about making sure that the mentors that you work with are representative of the population that you're working with. And so I'm wondering if that resonates with others' experience, or if you just want to speak to how does issues of millennials of color relate to your work.
I can respond from the philanthropy side. So I was recently in a room for the Grantmakers of Color networking group, and there was a man who had shared that this was the first time that he was in a room with mostly people of color. It was all people of color because it was the Grantmakers of Color networking group, but grant making and philanthropy is not a welcoming space for people of color. And there are a small number of organizations and philanthropists who are trying to drive that, to change the culture of philanthropy, to make it not only diverse and inclusive, but equitable as well, and understanding and meeting people where they're at. We internally have a commitment to being, not only a non-racist organization, but an anti-racist organization, and finding ways to include diverse communities and the communities that we serve in our decision-making process, and to support those communities in an equitable manner. So one of the aspects of our training that our professional development that we provide for free for all of our current and former grant recipients are 2-hour seminars on specific capacity building topics. And these are grassroots organizations who have figured out how to do things without having, professional access to professional consulting. And the value of their experiences and their work and being able to share that is immeasurable. So we have our grantees come in who are of diverse communities and are most of the time young leaders of color. And they present on capacity building topics and professional development topics for all of our other grant recipients. And not only do they do that, but we pay them to do that because we value their time and their expertise and are trying to incorporate more equitable practices in paying people for doing the work that we ask for them as philanthropists to do. I don't know if that answered your question.
It did. Does anyone else want to speak to that topic?
So I work in affordable housing and city planning, and it's always been sort of striking to me how often the rooms I'm in don't look at all like our communities, don't look at all like the room that we're sitting in right now. And I think some of the ways I personally have tried to disrupt that have been so I just started at my job at MHP a few months ago and was at my previous job at the Metropolitan Area Planning Council for about 9 years. So I can kind of speak a little bit to like what I was able to accomplish there, but also what I'm trying to do where I am now, in the sense of like just bringing up race and reaching out and kind of cutting to the chase with fellow colleagues of color, and kind of asking when I meet brand new people, just kind of testing the waters and seeing what the office culture is really like. And something I've found myself kind of gravitating towards over and over again in my day job, as well as I don't know how to describe my different hats, because day and night is not, they're both day and night, but in my role in Melrose as well, just thinking about, sorry, I'm rambling now. Hold on. We're just thinking about creating space for conversation, thinking about how we're recruiting folks, thinking about our cultural norms. Like, I find that there's a lot of things that are just sort of assumed, right? Like, you have a lunch meeting and you order sandwiches, and there's other foods than sandwiches. Thinking about what vendors you choose. Like, I think there's just a lot of different ways of trying to introduce conversation and just create the space to have uncomfortable moments and uncomfortable conversations and directly talk about race.
Thank you. Lawrence, do you have any comments on that?
Yeah, I'll just hop in kind of quickly. Two significant parts of my work are facilitation and communications. And so the piece that I'll share now that I think is relevant to Equity Matters is around storytelling. And a huge part of my work really is about helping both individual people and organizations that are a part of bigger systems understand what stories we are working within, what stories we believe, and how those stories then shape the action that we take. Right now I'm teaching a 4-week personal storytelling for social change workshop with the Podcast Garage, and a lot of what we're working on in that space is how does our individual understanding of our narrative impact what it is we think matters in the world, and then impact what steps we are choosing to make that world a better place, or a place that works for more and more people. And so when I think about equity as it relates to my personal story, but personal stories in general, I think equity is everybody getting what they need to succeed. And I think that is in actual direct opposition to equality, which is everyone getting the same thing, because all people don't need the same thing. And so as I think about personal stories and wage equity, you know, a friend of mine I've been in conversation with, in their hiring policies, they're talking about reparations for their staff. So if you have parents, grandparents who were discriminated against by systems, you know, maybe there's no individual person you can point to, but there's a person who would benefit from having compensation flow back in your lineage, which is a part of your story. You know, we both think that would be like a really dope thing. So, you know, as I think about equity, stories really matter, and then stories impact how we decide to move and act.
Thank you. I think it's very interesting that this piece on storytelling is coming up, because as we think about the solutions, right, when we're talking about how do we make these our workplaces more welcoming, more nurturing. You can hear me? No? Okay. Yeah? Is this any better? Much better. Awesome. I had a feeling. So we're talking about storytelling and the stories that we tell ourselves, right? And there's this piece about how can organizations retain talent like us, continue to develop us? And we can think about individual solutions. We can think about mentorship. We can think about compensation packages, perks. But then, are we really engaging in the right conversation? Because what we're pointing to right now is really systemic things that are in place that are preventing workplaces from being better for us. And so, with that in mind, let's move towards solution. Maybe not solution, but let's be hopeful about the future and how is it that we can make it better. So if you can share your thoughts on how the nonprofit sector can improve and what would make it better, a better, more sustainable place for millennials to work at. Anybody wants to get started?
I'll piggyback on your point about storytelling. I think one place to start, although it feels sort of like a soft touch and there are really concrete things we need to do as well, is by starting with storytelling. I think a lot of times just asking folks where they're coming from and like doing some team building, I think people find out a lot about each other, and it helps to test those norms that I think people make a lot of assumptions. Like one of the things I was reflecting on was the experience of a friend who lives in a high price downtown Boston apartment and felt very judged by her boss, who sort of like looked at it as, like she was walking the walk and she walks to work. She and her husband are both first generation college graduates. There are a lot of things sort of behind the scenes, and they're both professionals of color, that sort of like the immediate judgment of like, oh, we work in like the nonprofit or public sector, and what does that mean, and kind of unpacking that a layer, and then hearing things like, I don't know, just like having more self-reflection and learning each other's stories. I think another thing is just, I guess one thing I was gonna share was like personal experiences around just like policies like holidays and time off and understanding. So when I started my career, I worked at a little teeny nonprofit in Baltimore, and everybody at the organization was folks who pretty much lived and grew up in the area. It was the staff was like half black and half white, and then there was me, and they were also much older than me, so I was like the young, like everyone else was twice my age. And one of the things I experienced early on was like this feeling of like, I want to know what our holiday schedule is because I need to travel to see my family. And so I just think of like things like, or I want to know if I can take Diwali off, things like that, that is like something that I feel like there's professional development, there's other things that my colleagues here will probably talk about or that I could touch on more, but that's one thing that has struck me as like a policy, like having clear policies could help us.
Thank you for sharing that. I think often that is a blind spot for organizations. Jeanette?
Yeah, I think also to piggyback on that, I'll start with some ways that we can work within the current system and then a different way to think about the system, right? So thinking about the high burnout rate of nonprofit employees and how we can focus on self-care and how we can really incorporate a culture of self-care into our organizations that is meaningful and accessible for all, and how leadership models that self-care. And so if you have a vacation policy or other self-care related policies, but nobody's taking it, then what's the point of those policies? And if the leadership isn't taking it, if you see them working while they're on vacation, would you feel comfortable, checking out and not answering your email or just disengaging from work altogether? Creating an inclusive and inquisitive culture that allows people to fail and solicits honest feedback. I think that what we heard in the report was that there's this hierarchical structure of very high-level management people and then program people and no people in between. And so how can we create a culture of feedback and change to empower people that are on more junior level positions to create change within the organization? Respecting people's boundaries related to vacation inside and outside of work, I think is really important and doesn't cost any money. So why is there an expectation for you to check your email at 8 a.m. while you're on the train or 5:30 after you've left the office? it's unfair and inequitable. And then also allowing people to focus on their mental and physical wellness, because self-care isn't just about going to the gym. It's equipping and empowering people to understand other self-care tools and investing in themselves. The other thing related to policy is how are we creating inclusive organizations as a whole? So not just talking about millennials of color, but thinking about other historically excluded groups. Thinking about people who have religious holiday obligations that aren't traditionally Christian, people who are in the LGBTQ community. How are your HR policies and insurance policies supporting and inviting them to be full members of your organization? And one of the last things I'll say is, why are we always asking people to have advanced degrees for entry or junior level jobs? Because we recognize that higher level people of color have a higher barrier of entry into higher education, and we want to value, or we should value and uplift their experiences equally to education. I think one of the things that we saw in that report was that we don't have time to invest in professional development. So the cop-out is to say you have to have an advanced degree because you assume that that person's journey to professional development will be different and easier to manage. And then the systems level question I always have as a philanthropist, and I see things from across organizations and across types of programmatic work, is why this leadership structure? Why are we supporting a leadership structure that's based on white corporate America, when we are doing social change work and we have the luxury and the obligation to be creative and energetic in our work? I think philanthropy doesn't want to invest in different leadership models because it's uncomfortable. It doesn't look like what people see in their work life. But there are different ways that organizations can exist, co-directors, a flatter organizational model, different ways that boards can function in order to be able to support their work. And so I don't have an answer to this, it's just something I'm noodling around, but how can we shift the way that organizations even structurally exist in order to effectively create racial, social, and economic justice?
Amen to that.
That's my little diatribe.
Yep.
I just wanted to say two quick things. One about the org structure piece. I'm the president of the board of an organization here in Boston called Resist. It's a foundation. I think they're pretty dope. And over the last year to 2 years, they've shifted into what's called a worker self-directed structure. And so that's one thing that I won't get into detail here. Maybe in Q&A, if that's useful, go there, or talk to me afterwards, or just, most people in here seem millennial age, so Google's a thing. But that's one concrete thing, actually think about shifting the structure of your nonprofit. It's possible. And then, as I think about myself as someone who has been in the sector, the thing that would make the nonprofit sector in Boston better for me is actually blunt, direct, sometimes really difficult conversations about white supremacy in the sector. That is actually far and away the thing that would have the most impact, because I think it would impact things like gender, race, class, culture. If you go there, you get all those other things.
Great. Yeah, what I would add to this discussion is a challenge to the present leadership, which, as we know from the report, is majority white and majority female in the nonprofit sector. Sorry. Oh, thanks so much. Great. And the specific challenges that I would put forward, a collection of some of what I think are some of the best ideas that are really concrete. First is around succession planning for current leadership, to build our bench strength. So the upcoming and rising leaders within the organization, not people necessarily brought in from the outside. Succession plans that include explicit and measurable goals for the advancement of leaders of color within the organization presently. And then building on from that, connecting the performance assessment of executive leadership to specific diversity and inclusion metrics that the board is aware of and that get actually factored into their performance evaluations and tied to pay. And likewise, the counterpart to that, having professional development conversations is a required part of the performance assessment for all staff so that it's baked into those touch points for all staff. And then bringing it down to other aspects of the system. When we think about key projects and thought leadership that is coming up with an organization, and this can be seen in strategic planning processes or in various types of planning for organizations, ensuring that there are opportunities for existing staff, including and particularly staff of color, to participate in those projects for professional development. So not automatically resorting to bringing in consultants or contractors who may be in privileged positions who come in and do that really strategic, advanced work that can propel someone's career and leadership skills, but absorb those within the organization. And likewise, for the administrative burden, the tasks that are very, sort of burdensome administratively or just very time-consuming, thinking of creative ways to distribute that within the organization so that employees in more junior level positions can have some space to contribute to the strategic vision of the organization. And when we think about the wage equity gap and ways to mitigate that, obviously a best case scenario would be finding the resources to offer higher salaries. But there are other ways to decrease or to at least assist with one's personal expenses that aren't necessarily a salary increase. So what about flexible and remote work, right? When the cost of transportation and housing is so high, what is wrong with working from home and offering that essentially discount that you are saving on that T-Pass, on that parking, on that lift because it's 10:30 at night and you're kind of afraid to walk home to the T, right? To just those cost savings that is easily possible just through being able to work remotely. So those are some concrete ideas that I'd love to hear everyone's thoughts on in the Q&A as well.
All right. Thank you all so much for sharing your insight. I think that we touch upon some of the ideas, not just on the individual level, but collectively and systemically. So I want to make sure we honor our time and that we have the opportunity to make this what it was intended to be, which is a conversation. So we're going to open up the time to ask questions from the audience. I think we have a few mics going around, so I'm going to ask that you raise your hand, and as you ask your question, if you can be brief, and we'll take it from there. We need more mic. All right. Any questions? Right there on the back.
Hi, can you hear me? Hi everyone, my name is Diana Mancera, and so I work for a nonprofit as well. Is the Massachusetts State Coalition Against Sexual Assault and Domestic Violence. And so thank you so much for all your wisdom and thoughts. And I guess one of the things, I'm a millennial myself, and I hire millennials, particularly millennials of color, because I'm a woman of color, and I believe in that. And I do run into this issue with supervisors and people above me who are constantly sort of struggling with this piece of the rep that we have as millennials, like that we don't work as hard, that we believe that things should be given to us because, I don't know, because some of us had to go back to school. We didn't have an option, like when I graduated from undergrad, I didn't have an option. I had to go back to school because there were not jobs out there. So there's this rep that we have as millennials that we deserve the jobs and deserve to get higher positions because of our education or whatever that may be. And the self-care piece, as some of you mentioned. A lot of millennials today, we talk a lot about self-care, and nonprofits do not really like that word. So it's a multiple question, but how do you talk about the sort of rep that we have as millennials, and how do you address that, and how do you remove that too?
Definitely. Any takers on this one?
I don't know if anyone here has strong opinions on baby boomers, but I do. And I'll save you all from hearing them, but I don't know what you can do to push back against people who are prejudiced against you based on the generation you were born in, right? Like, it seems like they aren't open to learning anyway. If what they're doing is treating you as an individual as a entire caricature of your generation. So I'm not very helpful on that. And then the only other thing I'll say related to self-care is on the philanthropic end, if we're investing in the effectiveness and the sustainability of organizations, but we're forgetting that what that requires is treating individuals as human beings and supporting them as human beings, then we're doing the whole sector a disservice. And so people from my end have to continue to drive that conversation and to say when we see things in budgets, that's great, but how are you sustaining yourself? Like, how are you gonna continue to do this change-making work? Because I've seen too many grassroots community leaders drop out, fall out, go into the corporate sector, or just, I've seen somebody leave the country because they just burned out completely and entirely. And so thinking about how we as funders have that conversation and stop balking at things like, oh, you have this line item in your budget to support professional development or self-care or whatever, because those things are vital to making a thriving and robust sector.
Thank you.
Sure, and I'll pass it to you. So, you go. I don't know what's with me today. I'm like losing my train of thought.
We'll circle back.
So I would say I've been in a situation like that, and the lessons that I feel like I've learned, step one is actually to listen, which is actually not always my first piece of advice, because like sometimes I actually don't want to listen to what you have to say because I disagree deeply. But it's been my experience that listening at the beginning of those types of conversations to hear like what is it that they actually are complaining about. And then once I have a good understanding of that, stage two is to have a very explicit, like, goals-oriented conversation. So like you as a supervisor, what are your goals when you're supervising blank person or blank group of people? And then as someone who holds some of those identities, I can say, my goals as someone who works here is this. And what has happened several times in stage three is, oh, it turns out we actually have goals that make sense together, and we can strategize about how we help each other out in that moment. I will say that has backfired one time. So, you know, by no means is listening always a thing that works, especially as people of color, like most of us know, that listening doesn't always help. Sometimes it hurts. So I've had friends who tried to go in with that strategy and have, you know, gotten burned by it because they were explicit about the fact that they have needs that their job isn't meeting. And so the supervisor was like, oh, well, we can't do that, so bye. And it's possible that could happen, but it's been the majority of my experience that people who are in supervision roles actually just want to make sure that they are covering their tails. And so having those conversations can help.
I remembered. Data. So there's data that says that millennials are not just all about avocado toast, lattes, and craft beer, which also is a sort of, yeah, I mean, I think we do broadly like those things, but there's also sort of like a, there's also this sort of caricature of what a millennial is, and it is sort of a, well, like a person with an maybe advanced degree, probably white, people of color too. So there's that to challenge, but there is data that shows that, that's all around this room, but also that shows, you know, the housing prices, childcare. I mean, I sent my kid to baby college when he was an infant. It was $20,000 for the first year. Yeah, surprise. There is cheaper childcare. The Princess Charlotte, is that? Yeah, anyway, in the UK, the princess they're paying less for childcare than what most parents in Massachusetts would have to pay. So there's data to show that there are these disparities. And then I think this whole idea of millennials being all about wanting mission-oriented work, just challenging that and saying, what's wrong with that? But I think the other thing I'm seeing in my work is I'm concerned about our generations being more segregated. In our housing conversations, we're talking a lot about senior housing or housing for families, housing for kids, and housing for empty nesters. And I think we actually need to make sure that we're talking to each other, because what I'd love to see is actually more age-friendly, across the age spectrum society, because baby boomers aren't the problem, millennials aren't the problem, Gen Xers exist. So I don't know, I think just the storytelling, eliciting stories, and one of the ways I do that in my work is sort of asking people around the room, what's your housing story? If I see, folks who maybe have kids or grandkids saying, can your kid afford to live in this community? Can someone who looks different from them afford to live in that community? And then I think that level of personalizing helps get that conversation past that stuck point of millennials as a monolith.
If you're looking for that data, I would recommend a book, Kids These Days. I'm sorry, I don't remember the name of the author, but he was prominent in the Occupy Wall Street movement, written by a millennial, intended to refute the very common talking points that we hear disparaging millennials, bringing forth the economic data and social data.
Thank you. It's great advice. Back there? Oh, wait. Yep.
Me.
I have a blind spot.
Thank you. I'm here.
I hear you.
I'm Andrew Sharp. Thanks for putting on such a great discourse, and big up to the nonprofit. Hey. One of the issue I find, and I don't know if it's a cultural issue, where I find that in most organizations, and since I've moved here and I've been doing a lot of research, and especially for my Caribbean diaspora community, when you look at the organization and you look at the members and the board members, everyone is old, about 50, let's say 45. And you have the younger generation, which is the younger Caribbean diaspora. So how do we make that change in terms of getting some of these old folks, these old fogey, excuse me if you're old in here, but to understand, to get these younger ones more involved? Because what I find too is that a lot of the younger folks look at the organization and say, oh, I can't bother with that because it's all old folks in it. And then you have that generation gap. You have that interest being lost. So how do we go about that? Should we set time limits on them? And sorry to say, I'm going to bring up politics again. Look at Congress, all these old folks. Come on. So.
Thank you. So how do we keep it moving? Anybody? Any insights?
Yes to term limits, period. And I think that can actually be used as an asset, or term limits can be seen as an opportunity. I have a friend who's on an organization's board where they actually have really, strategic might be the word, they have conversations with people as they come onto the board about what is it that you want to do while you're on this board. You have a term limit, it's 4 years. So in this 4 years, what is it that you want to move while you're here? Great. Now when we're in these board meetings, we can have these conversations about connecting to your folks because you're bringing a new audience, or expanding the size of the org's budget because you're a fundraiser, whatever it is. But so yes to term limits, they can be an asset as opposed to this thing that's seen as fearful or bad. And then something I've experienced, having been, or I'm new to the Resist board, but we have had transition meetings, and the transition was actually seen, or I saw the transition meeting as a way to learn from these elders who had been in like movement spaces for a long time and had learned a lot of things. Some of those things are not relevant anymore, which is, I think, part of why there's an urge to like move people out of those spaces. But it was actually really important for the current board to learn the things that the old board knew so that we don't repeat those mistakes, and so that we have that knowledge and wisdom to then learn the things that we need to be learning right now as we work to support this organization that's doing, whatever it's doing. So those are two things.
Yeah, I would say that there is going to be a certain amount of bravery and boldness that is going to come in to claiming our seat on the board or at the table. And it might be uncomfortable in the beginning. And I think that everyone comes with a different why, that they are working on social justice issues. Sometimes it's very personal, sometimes it's more abstract. And I think we're all going to need to own our own why and recognize that may be different from someone else. But your why for being at that table and claiming your seat on the board or claiming your leadership position is just as valid. And I think whatever you need to have that source of strength and confidence in owning that position, find it. So find those communities, whether spaces like this where you can connect with others who are trying to blaze new paths and open new doorways that have felt very closed and have often been very closed, and use those communities as sources of strength, and invite in others who may not feel comfortable having attended an event like this. Next time, bring your friend who wouldn't necessarily have thought to come to this, or that this was a relevant discussion for them.
Another thing, and yes, definitely term limits. It gives you a neutral way to have that conversation about people stepping off boards and sets expectations. But people, and you might want to look at your bylaws, but they don't have to be on your board in order to serve on some board committees, right? So you can create a board committee of committed millennials that are involved in your community and are passionate, and if there's someone who's on your board who is an ally to that, to invite them to serve on that committee as well and empower them to create change within your organization. Probably don't put them on the social media team, because I think that's what everybody thinks millennials love to do. But really invest in how they want to contribute to your organization. That's also a really nice way for people who are new to board service to understand what board culture is like, and it sets them up for success if you decide to officially invite them on your board.
I just want to give a quick shout out to the Milking Institute for Community Building, one organization the Milking Institute for Community Building. I put a couple of flyers back there for some upcoming trainings. They do board trainings. Having served on a board and feeling kind of like a fish out of water, like I have things to contribute here, but I don't know what's going on or how to do that. I think the training is really valuable. I think through a thread through this conversation that I've been thinking also a lot about is how can you both train folks in the system you have, but also think about how to evolve your system or create some flexibility within it in terms of what those roles could look like.
I want to summarize what I said earlier because I think I rambled a little bit. What I meant to say is tell your board members that it's an opportunity for them to help train the next generation by stepping off and supporting that.
Thank you, and thank you for the emphasis on creating spaces outside of the normal structures, right? We think that we can only have influence as a board, but if we think about young professionals groups that lead into the pipeline of leadership of your organization, it's also a way to integrate that new fresh blood. I think we may have time for one more question. Back here, who has the mic? Oh, okay.
Hi. So, not that I think there's a really straightforward answer to this, but I'm going to ask it because I'd like to get feedback. So what would you, can you see me? So what suggestions do you have for like increasing pay in the nonprofit sector generally? Because like in one role, I'm assistant director of my department, another role, I'm a professor, and very few of my students like mention that they want to go into the nonprofit sector. And when I mention it, like the first thing they say is, well, the pay is low. I can find a comparable job in the private sector or even in the public sector. And I just want to know, like, outside of begging for excess grant money, like how can you like increase those salaries so that we can attract those people into our organizations?
Any insight from our panel? How do we generate money?
And I think it's part of a broader discussion in terms of the sources of funding for nonprofits and what they value in funding, right? So capacity building and professional development. So to a certain extent, it is co-education with funders, I think, on the value of providing competitive wages. And that's a tough conversation, but if we all in this sector are having that with our individual donors and making that known in our grants, it will start to be heard, and it is becoming I think more known as a need, that focusing on the smallest possible administrative costs, i.e. Actually the folks who are delivering the services, that's not the metric we want to use, right? And so, but having that conversation with funders, I think is a slow but important process that we all need to be part of.
Thank you. Any final remarks from our panel? How are we doing on time? I just want to make sure. Do we have time for one more question? Yes, so there was one on my right side wherever the mic is. Oh, awesome.
Hi, Lab. I guess, Warren, you mentioned briefly at the beginning white supremacy, and I feel like that's our undercurrent of this whole conversation for me is the problems with white supremacy and capitalism. But that's a different conversation. But at the same time, it's not. But I'm curious in the philanthropy work and then also in the nonprofit spaces that all of you are traveling through, how you see, I think millennials generally are a little bit further along in this conversation around white supremacy and capitalism and the problems that they bring. So how have you seen successfully, or how would you envision successful education for folks who feel competent in those spaces, talking about those issues when they see them come up?
Great question.
Just to clarify, do you mean like people who work at nonprofits where white supremacy culture is dominant?
Yeah,
or like,
I think, so I'm coming from this as a white executive director of an organization that is populated by and employed with women of color, and but then also a larger national organization that is not. So I'm trying to balance in between my community and the larger community, which is a little bit older and much whiter.
So I'll say maybe two things. Actually, I want to back up to just echo the like educate your funders thing, both for wages and as it relates to white supremacy. I've seen organizations often based in California in the Bay who are sort of leading on some of this, but it's actually in your funders' interests, because they're often interested in solving problems, to talk about white supremacy because it creates lots of problems. And so co-education, I think, is a good strategy for that. Like, we as an organization are going through anti-racism training. We're inviting our board members into that because we need to be having these conversations together, because if you have a conventional nonprofit structure, your board is in charge of approving your work. And so if the board is having that conversation with you, I think that can be a really helpful thing. And I think the other thing I'll say on just dealing with white supremacy in spaces is assuming, like, come to the workplace assuming that that's what's normal, and actually build your structures in a way that respond to that normalcy. Like, I just assume that everyone, when they come into work, that they have had some sort of aggression lobbed at them on the train, on the bus, in their car, on the news, wherever. So like building the culture of your organization to assume that as baseline, and that then makes it a lot easier to have some of those conversations, and it makes it a lot easier for people who have been harmed by those things, sometimes very immediately, sometimes in a longer arc, to just bring it up. Like, oh, I think we have a racism problem here, and it shows up in this way, and can we just talk about that? Yeah, I have a lot more things to say, but I'm gonna stop there.
Just another book recommendation. So you want to talk about race? Give you some good tips for establishing a common vocabulary, which actually really, common vocabulary and language, which really is the first step in even really having equity conversations.
I think continuing to be a rabble rouser and like talk about it, but also finding, I mean, this is sort of piggybacking on things we've already said, but I've found it really helpful to have those spaces either within affinity groups or within sort of folks who are also grappling with these same issues. Like it's like free therapy to go and find a book club where we're really just all talking about race together and unpacking white supremacy and then taking another crack at it.
I do also want to recognize that there's power dynamics at play, especially with funders and nonprofits, and it shouldn't be the burden of nonprofits to educate funders to do this work. Funders should also be held accountable internally and have people internally driving this work. I lost my train of thought. No, it's okay. I've seen those conversations go really poorly in spaces, and I think it's just around creating intentional spaces for people to feel comfortable to talk about race. And sometimes when people say white supremacy, they don't understand the definition that we're using to talk when we say white supremacy. And so just allowing people to fully enter spaces and have philanthropy drive conversation internally while also having the nonprofit, recognizing the nonprofit sector is really leading in this, and that we have a lot of catching up to do. I think that's also related to how do you pay people? Well, you pay people, like if people give unrestricted, large, multi-year grants to support your work, but grant makers don't do that. And I think it's a bigger conversation and frustration that I have around accountability in the foundation sector, because we don't report to anyone. We don't have to collaborate. We don't have to learn. We don't have to grow. There are donor advised funds where you don't even know who's managing the money. And so, you know, one of the messages I'd like to leave for any funders who are in the room is how are we thinking about like partnering with communities and radical transparency and making sure that the actions that we're doing are supporting and not harming the organizations that and the issues that we're partnering or that we're advancing.
Thank you so much for sharing. It looks like we have time for one more question on the right side of the room where the mic is. Excellent.
Hi, my name is Kelly and I work with Cristina actually at Silver Lining Mentoring. So my question is relating to spaces in the nonprofit sector that say they're progressive, they think they're progressive, they are doing some things, the conversations are being had, but real radical change is either it's so slow and incremental that it feels like nothing or like just barely anything, or otherwise they want the people of color in the organization or just people in color in general, like consultants, whatever, to be doing this work, to be educating people, to be on the ground. And the onus is really not on the white executive leadership to push things through and to set the tone at the top. Like they're like, oh, this is great. I know that the research supports we should be doing this and whatever. I know it's important. I'm just gonna let these people do it. So my question for you is, how do we put the onus on those people? And how do we really have conversations, not about the elementary things, but with people who say they're progressive about what is like the fierce urgency of now? Like, what does that mean, and what should we be doing today?
Any takers?
I know it's complicated of a question.
I mean, one of the things, and I'm going to sound like a broken record, right, is that because funders have power, funders need to have commitments to policies and procedures that reflect social justice, racial justice values, and they need to start having conversations with executive directors around how they are implementing those policies within nonprofits. And I think you learn from communities on what change needs to happen, and then we can lead from a position of power and in partnership with community. But I think that that's one of the ways in which we try and have a voice, especially around self-care too, which is something that people don't invest in a lot. We see a lot of burnout, and we don't want people to do that. So we start the conversation. We start having those conversations, and the more that people in position of power can prioritize policies like racial and social and economic justice internally within organizations, the faster change happens.
Thank you. Do we have one more?
Yeah, this is definitely a soapbox of mine, so I'm going to try not to do all the things. Something that I deeply believe, and this is from Pedagogy of the Oppressed by Paulo Freire. He just says straight up, like, it is the work of oppressed people to liberate themselves and then to liberate their oppressors. Like, I don't like hearing that. And he makes a really clear case as to why people who exist in oppressor spaces literally can't see what it is they're doing. And systems of oppression are designed to prevent them from seeing it. So, you know, again, that's not a thing that I like to think about and hear, but sometimes I run book groups on Pedagogy of the Oppressed because I think it's so important to just like understand that that is sort of the base level. Now, if you disagree with that insight, so be it. We can have that conversation too, but that's sort of one thing that I've just started to move with. I think another thing that he says in his organizing model is part of the way that people who are oppressed make it really obvious to oppressors why oppression should end is because it's actually in the interest of the oppressor to end the oppression. It doesn't make sense to them because they exist in a system that convinces them that they're good, but actually they're not good. And what we see with all types of oppression, gender, race, class, ability, sexual orientation, et cetera, is that people who are in the oppressor group actually have to self-harm in order to oppress someone else. And that self-harm is literal disconnection from parts of our identities. Like, men actually disconnect from their ability to feel in order to oppress other people. People who are heterosexual, they tear their mental ability to connect intimately with people of their same gender because heteropatriarchy convinces us that being heterosexual is everything and like you have to exist in this one way. Anyways, I'm not gonna dig way into that. But it actually is in the interest of the oppressors to end the oppression, and there are, in that book and many other books, ways to make that a really clear, concrete pathway to shifting people's understanding about what white supremacy is and why it should end. Like, ending white supremacy actually helps white people. Yeah, I'll stop.
Again, I want to make sure that we honor the time that was allotted for this section. I want to first ask you for a round of applause for our panelists for sharing their experience. I also want to thank you because I think this section really encompassed the spirit of the night, which is ask difficult questions, make sure that we have space for reflection to find patterns and commonalities, to share resources, and that's what tonight was about. And I want to make sure that we have the space to continue to do that. We have another section where you can continue to network. I'm sorry if we didn't get to all of the questions, but definitely if you want to continue, approach one of us. This is what the space is for. And just a little reminder, when you came in, you had a bingo card that was about connecting with people and having very intentional conversations. So just remind you about that. There's some really awesome prizes. So Just once again, thank you, and give yourself a round of applause for making the space and the time to come here.